Good morning, everyone, and happy Valentine's Day. Today is a day we celebrate love. I hope that you are surrounded by love today. I hope that you have significant others to love today. And let me begin by saying that God loves you with a deep, all-encompassing, and unconditional love. When Pastor Ross asked me to speak this morning, he gave me a choice of a number of passages from the book of Mark. And as I looked through them, you may not be surprised that I was attracted to this particular one, Mark chapter 12, because it's about the greatest commandment, and the greatest commandment is about love. Valentine's Day has been around for a long time as a celebration of love. The ancient Romans, a couple thousand years ago, had celebrations in February to bring young men and women together, hoping that some romances would develop. And then the ancient Roman Catholic Church established February 14th as a commemorative day for someone called Valentinus, a church leader who was martyred, killed because he was a Christian by Emperor Claudius in a persecution in the 3rd century. And our practice of celebrating romantic love goes way back to the 13 or 1400s in France and England, when young men and young women were getting together for romance and possibly marriage, and some families were trying to arrange marriages for their children. It's said they picked that time of year because they had noticed that the birds were starting to mate at that time in February. But you know there's not much of that going on here right now because it's still far too cold. But the celebration stuck in February, and so here we are on February 14th, and it's about love. We're going to look today at love in this passage. It's about how we are meant to love God and love others. First, we have the context of the Great Commandment, the question and Jesus' answer, the relationship of Jesus with the law. And second, we'll look more closely at the command to love God with all our heart and soul and mind and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves. So first, the context of the Great Commandment. The teacher of the law asked Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And I imagine Jesus is somewhere where he is bumping into these fellows like a synagogue or a temple. And it reminded me of when I was at seminary, and it wasn't uncommon for us seminarians when we got together to talk theology. And so they asked Jesus this question. And maybe it was a test. They were always testing Jesus with their questions, and Jesus is usually challenging them and rebuking them or setting them straight. But here, they both agree, which really is an amazing thing. And I think because of that, we need to pay special attention to this passage. What they are talking about is of utmost importance because it is very close to and at the heart of the kingdom. It might not be a surprise that these Jewish religious teachers were talking about which commandment was the greatest. They actually put together 613 commandments that they thought were important, 365 do-nots, and 248 do's. That's a lot to remember. In answering, Jesus quotes the Old Testament from Deuteronomy, where it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. Do not seek revenge," in Leviticus 19:18. "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." I like this comment from one of the translations, and it's in your outline. Although Jesus is asked for only the single most important commandment, love God and love others, he gives these two things, love God and love others. He includes both because these two teachings can never be really separated from each other. Some people think they can love God and ignore people. But Jesus frequently makes it clear that loving God apart from loving his people is impossible. It's an odd thing, in a way, to think of love and law or commandment being related to each other and together. You know, we tend to think about love as a romantic thing and as kind of a crazy thing where we let all the fetters go. That's such a powerful emotion that it bypasses all of our regular rational thinking in our brain. I remember being in love like that. When I was 25 years old, I met this beautiful young woman from Winnipeg. At the time, I was living in Cape Breton. And the only way we could communicate in those days was by letter or telephone. There was no internet, no social media, and no cell phones. And I know some of you are wondering how we ever survived. One time I was on my way back home from Halifax, driving along the Bredor Lakes and heading back home to Sydney Mines. And I really wanted to get home because I was sure that there would be a letter there for me from Jean. The snowstorm was underway, the snow was blowing, the roads were white, and I noticed that all the truckers had stopped at a roadside diner instead of continuing on. And the farther I went, I noticed that the snowplows were on the road, and I was having real trouble seeing where the road was because it was just covered by snow. But anyway, I pressed on against all good sense and reason because I was in love. Luckily, I survived. We got married, and this year we're going to celebrate one of those big anniversaries with a 0 behind it. The nature of love that Jesus is talking about is different than this crazy romantic love that we tend to think about all the time. It is what is required. It is what is commanded. It seems more serious and more comprehensive. It is meant to be expressed from our total being and in all our conduct and relationships. I just want to make a few comments about Jesus and the commandments. It's probably important for us to remember. He affirms them as he does here, especially the moral part of the law and the commandments. He in himself also embodied them. If we want to see how someone could live in a way to live them out, we look at Jesus. He also fulfilled the sacrificial demands of the Old Testament law, and he himself became the perfect sacrifice for us, so that we no longer have to come to church and offer sacrifices of animals or food offerings, because Jesus has become the perfect sacrifice for all of us. And if you take the time to read the book of Hebrews, you'll see there this teaching about Jesus as the perfect sacrifice, the perfect priest, the perfect king. And Jesus also replaced the function of the law in making us acceptable to God. Our righteousness is not by the works of the law or following commandments, but it's by faith alone in what he has done for us. Now, sometimes we think that love and law or commandment don't go together. You ever hear anybody say, well, if you really loved me, you wouldn't give me so many rules to follow. But love and commandment belong together. As a young boy, my son, Sean, would run out into the streets. I don't know how old he was then, maybe 3 or maybe a little younger, but he was walking, and he never walked anywhere. He just ran everywhere, and he would like to run away from me and try to get me to catch him. So that was a little dangerous when we were walking on the sidewalk beside the street, and we used to put a leather harness on him, and it had a little leash attached to it, so that if he tried to dart out into the street, I'd have a hold of him. Now, I know some of you young parents might think that's barbaric today, but that's the way we did it back then. And I kept him safe that way. And later on, as he grew older, I taught him about how to deal with crossing the street, the do's and the don'ts. Stop, look and listen. Look both ways before you cross the street. So these commandments are an expression of my love for him. As a good father, I don't want him to get hurt or killed. And our commandments that we receive from God are expressions of God's love for us. Dr. Cherry in seminary used to teach us in ethics that God wasn't a killjoy in giving us the commandments, The commandments showed us the way to the good life. They showed us the way to the good life. They showed us the boundaries beyond which it's dangerous to go. They're like the rumble strips of life. You know those noisy rumble strips when you're on the highway? If you get a little sleepy or you wander off, they certainly wake you up in a hurry. The law is like that. They're like the boundary markers on a ski hill. And you know that it's dangerous if you get off the right path. And tragically, we saw that somebody did that recently and ended up in the woods and being killed because they got off the beaten path, the safe path, the marked path of the ski hill. So the commandments are there for our good, not to make life tough, difficult, or a drag. Now let's look at these commandments. First, the commandment to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. I heard a song this summer that caught my ear. It's called Half Your Love. Darling, I would love to see, I wonder what the world could be if you would only give to me half your love. Half your love I fought to get you. Half your love ever since I met you. Half your love, it's twice as much as I'm ever gonna need. I could fly on one good wing. There's dreams enough with only half your love. Well, I don't think that's going to work out too well in a relationship, really, only half your love. A marriage is not going to work very well, for example, with only half love involved. It doesn't work very well. And this commandment that we have to love God asks not for half our love, but for total dedication, all of our love. God deserves a complete, dedicated love from us. It involves our heart, which are our affections and our desires. And there are so many things in the world to tempt us. So many lesser things that we can love, like money or possessions or power or even technology. But we are asked to love God with our heart. One of the ways we express our affections to God is worship. And I know we're all looking forward to the time when we can get back together in the church again and sing together. That's one of the beautiful things of being together as the people of God, when we get to worship together and to sing and praise God. And that's when we're opening our heart to God and expressing our feelings. I was thinking of the hymn, I love you, Lord, and I lift up my voice to worship you, oh my soul rejoice. That's one expression of our hearts that we do together to God in worship. We love God when we let God also love us and fill our hunger for the unconditional love that nobody else in the world can give us. I was brought up in a Christian church, but it was when I truly felt God's love when I was a teenager, and I asked Jesus to fill me with that unconditional love and fill my being with it at that age. That's when it became real to me. The soul is one of the deepest parts of ourselves. And God is asking to communicate with the deepest parts of who we are, and for the deep parts of Him to communicate with us. You see this kind of language in Psalm 42, where deep calls to deep. The soul of God seeks to commune with our soul, and we can experience this when we pray, for example, in the quietness of our prayer time, when we are alone with God, and we put aside the distractions of the world and seek to listen to God's voice. With our heart, with our soul, and then with our mind. With our mind, we're trying to think like a Christian. No, I was very blessed to be able to be part of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship when I was in high school and in early university years, and later on to work for InterVarsity as a staff worker. And one thing about that movement was that it always challenged us to think critically as Christians, to identify the presuppositions in what people were telling us, to try to gather information widely and avoid being ghettoized, and by that I mean only listening to the people who agree with you or only teach one thing or one view, but rather getting a broad understanding of an issue and trying to think as a Christian through it. That challenge is still before us today, maybe even more so in the age of social media. And of course, we have the opportunity to exercise our minds as we study the scriptures, the Bible that we have, that God gave us, the teachings of the Old and New Testament. And then with our strength, that's with our dedicated, sustained effort, not giving up easily and persevering. When we combine our physical strength together, we can do many things as a congregation, as a group of people, and to help each other. And the second commandment is to love our neighbor as ourselves. This is a reflection of God's love for us. When we love other people, we reflect that we experience God's love in ourselves and know that we want to share it with others. And in Jesus' day, the Jews understood this only to be righteous, fellow, legitimate Jews who were their neighbor. But Jesus expands this to mean anyone that we meet. And I like what Mitten said, it's all within our home, those we meet at work, in our church, in our recreations, and more than that, our employer is our neighbor too. So are our work people, all who serve us in shops, the men who empty our dustbins, and those who try to keep the streets and parks clean. So are persons of other countries and other cultures. I was saddened to hear the story earlier on this week that one of our neighbor churches, Bedford United Church, earlier in the year, when things were stirred up, put out a sign, Black Lives Matter. And the vandalism and the threats they received and the nasty phone calls, very disturbing. I'm saddened to hear that story. Just one systemic example of how far we have to go in loving our neighbor as ourselves. This command means, at least, as a minimum, treating someone else as I would want to be treated. It doesn't even begin to describe what going the extra mile might involve. And I want to remind you that Jesus also gave a new commandment in John 15. He said, love one another as I have loved you. Love one another as I have loved you. You know, when I was thinking about love and just the enormity and the intensity of this love that we're asked to give to God, I was thinking back to a story that I encountered in school, probably maybe in junior high school. We had this story of The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry. And in this story, it's a story about love, about a young couple, Della and Jim. And they're young and they really are poor. They don't have a lot of money. But it's coming up to Christmas time and they want to give some gifts to each other, something special. Well, Della, her pride and joy was her beautiful long hair. You probably remember this story. It was her beautiful long hair. And it was a treasure to her. And it was her greatest beauty. And for Jim, his greatest possession was his pocket watch. And, you know, this story was published in 1905. So in those days, it wasn't unusual probably for the men to have a vest and to have a pocket watch in the pocket of their vest. And his gold pocket watch, that was his prized possession. So Della wanted to buy Jim something special, but she had no money. So she went and she had her hair cut off, and she sold her hair, and with the money, she bought Jim a gold chain for his pocket watch. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to her, Jim, wanting to give her a really special gift, went and sold his pocket watch and bought her some beautiful combs for her hair. I couldn't help but think of that story as I was thinking about this love. You can see in the story the heart, the soul, the thoughtfulness, and the strength in the story of this love. And we feel passion, the depth, the thoughtfulness, and the sacrifice in what they did for each other. Love and commandment belong together. And we can err in either direction, you know. Sometimes if we go too far one direction, if we say, oh, well, you know, I know that I'm a Christian and I don't have to worry about how I live because Jesus just loves me all the time and will forgive me for everything. Well, right throughout the Christian era and the ages, that kind of thinking has been discouraged and has been condemned. But nobody likes the other side either, the legalist, who's going to say, who's really strict about keeping all the rules and can easily denounce other people and act in self-righteous and moralistic ways. No one likes to be around a person like that. Someone who's so right that it hurts. We need a balanced way. We need a balanced way. Love and law belong together. So in summary, I suppose it would have been a lot easier if Jesus answered this question about the greatest commandment and said, okay, just make sure you go to church every Sunday. That would have made it very easy for all of us. But instead, he gave us this huge challenge to have complete love for God and compassionate love for our neighbor. It means that every single part of our lives, every encounter that we have, everything that happens to us, every day we need to consider how to live in the spirit of these commandments, loving God with our heart and soul and mind and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves. So may God help us to do our best with this very high challenge. We're going to have some successes, we're going to have some failures. It's going to be a struggle. And if you take the time to read Romans 7, you'll see that the Apostle Paul talks about this struggle, and he knows what is right to do, but he struggles to do it. And Christ in his mercy will empower us, I believe. And Christ in his mercy will forgive us when we fail. And then we need to be gentle and encouraging with each other. And we need to try to live out the spirit of these commandments in our personal lives and in our community life as well. So my prayer for myself and my prayer for you is this: may I and may we all find a happy balance in our lives and find the freedom to love God with all our being and all our neighbors as ourselves. I just want to remind you of one other thing that Jesus said. He, or I'll say he or she who has my commandments and keeps them, he or she it is who loves me. He or she who has my commandments and keeps them, he or she it is who loves me. Now, if you're in your groups, either in your homes or online, I've given you a few questions, and 4 questions, and here they are for you to consider. What in this message stood out to you today? What are the sources of love in your life? How do you assess yourself against the standards of loving God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength? What is the one thing that you could do to get closer to the ideal of loving your neighbor as yourself? Thank you.